There's a version of this story where I'm the villain. I understand that. I've sat across from enough lawyers, enough federal agents, enough people with folders full of documents with my name on them to understand that from the outside, the paper trail does not look like ignorance. It looks like participation. It looks, in certain lights, like expertise. I need you to understand that I was 26 years old, that I was in love for the first time in my life, in the way that makes you stupid, and that the things I didn't ask questions about, I didn't ask questions about because I was afraid of what the answers might cost me. That's not innocence. I know that now, but it's also not what they initially thought I was. My name is Renata. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, the daughter of a woman who worked 2 jobs and a father who was mostly a concept rather than a presence. I put myself through community college, got a certificate in accounting and bookkeeping, and by the time I was 24, I was working for a small firm that handled books for local businesses, restaurants, 2 car dealerships, a chain of nail salons. It was not glamorous work. It paid $38,000 a year, and I was grateful for it. I met Daniel at a quinceañera for the daughter of one of my coworkers. He was 31, tall, dressed in the specific way that announces money without shouting about it. Watch, shoes, the kind of haircut that costs more than my weekly grocery run. He ran an import business, he said, wholesale distribution of consumer goods between Mexico and Texas. Housewares, electronics components, textiles. His family had been in cross-border trade for 30 years. He was warm and attentive and funny, and he called when he said he would, which was more than I could say for every man I dated before him. We were together for 3 months before I spent the night. That felt significant to me. It felt like I was being careful. I was not being careful. I was being slow. Those are different things. At the 8-month mark, Daniel mentioned, casually over dinner, that he was looking for someone reliable to help manage the administrative side of his business. His current bookkeeper was retiring. He knew I had the skills. He wasn't asking me to leave my job. He said it could be part-time, weekend work, reconciling accounts and handling some transfers. He would pay me $1,500 a month on top of my salary. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was in love and I was being offered a raise, and I told myself it was practical, that it made sense to build something together. Looking back, I think I also told myself that being useful to him would mean he'd stay, which is its own kind of sad. The work was not complicated at first. There were several LLCs, 4 of them, with names that meant nothing to me at the time. 2 named after geographic features, 1 that sounded like a real estate company, and 1 that was just a string of initials. Money moved between them on a schedule. Vendors in Mexico were paid through one account, receipts came into another. I reconciled figures, flagged discrepancies, generated reports. The paperwork looked legitimate. That's the thing I come back to constantly. The paperwork looked completely legitimate. There were invoices, there were manifests, there were what appeared to be real accounts with real transaction histories. If you're a 26-year-old bookkeeper and someone puts legitimately formatted documents in front of you, your job is to make the numbers match. I made the numbers match. There were things that nagged at me, small things I filed away in the part of my brain reserved for questions I wasn't asking. The cash. Daniel's business operated with a significant amount of cash. Not unusual, he explained, for businesses that dealt with vendors in regions where banking infrastructure was inconsistent. Cash came in, was deposited into one of the LLCs, appeared in the ledger as proceeds from documented sales. The documentation always existed. It was always there, in a folder, ready. I noticed after a few months that the documentation was always ready a little too fast, like it had been prepared before the transaction rather than after it. I did not ask about this. The volume. By the time I had been doing Daniel's books for about 6 months, the numbers I was working with had grown significantly. What had started as a business doing what seemed like moderate volume, maybe $80,000 to $100,000 a month moving through the accounts, was now processing closer to $400,000. I mentioned it once, just said the numbers were getting big. He said they'd landed a major retail contract, that the business was scaling. He showed me a contract. It looked real. I made the numbers match. The third thing, the thing I have the hardest time forgiving myself for, was the name I saw twice in transaction records, partially redacted in one document and fully visible in another. It was a surname that I recognized, not personally, but in the way that someone who grew up in San Antonio and paid attention to the news would recognize it. It was a name that appeared occasionally in stories about violence along the border, about trafficking routes, about organizations that the DEA had been trying to dismantle for over a decade. I told myself it was a coincidence, a common name. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the kind of thing I was imagining happened to other people and not to girls from San Antonio who were careful. I made the numbers match. The knock on my apartment door came on a Thursday morning in March. I was getting ready for work. I was wearing one earring. I opened the door to two men and a woman in dark jackets, and the woman held up a badge and said my full name as a question, and my whole body cold from the feet up. There were 6 of them total, DEA and IRS criminal investigation, working jointly. They came in with a warrant. They took my laptop, my work files, 2 external hard drives, my phone. They left me a receipt for everything they took, which I thought was almost absurdly polite given the circumstances. One agent, older, gray at the temples, with the exhausted patience of someone who has done this hundreds of times, asked me to sit down. He put photographs on my coffee table. The photos were of Daniel, taken from a distance in the way surveillance photos are, grainy and clinical. And then more photos, men I didn't recognize, a warehouse I'd never seen, vehicles with plates I couldn't read. Then he put documents on the table, documents I recognized immediately, documents with my formatting on them, reconciliation reports in my layout with my signature at the bottom. He said, "Miss Renata, how long have you been working for Daniel's organization?" I said, "His import business, about 14 months. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "It's not an import business." I don't know how to describe the sensation of having the floor drop out from underneath your understanding of your own life. It's not like shock exactly. Shock implies surprise, and part of me had been, for months, performing a very elaborate not knowing that required constant maintenance. It was more like relief and terror arriving simultaneously, the relief of no longer having to maintain the not knowing, and the terror of what the knowing actually contained. Over the next 4 hours, they told me what they knew and watched my face while they told me. I have since learned this is standard. They measure your reactions against what they expect from someone who was guilty versus someone who was genuinely surprised. I cannot tell you exactly what my face did, but I can tell you that I cried, which I had not done in a long time, and that I asked twice to use the bathroom, and both times a female agent accompanied me to the door and waited outside. The organization Daniel worked for, and I will not use its name here because I still live in Texas and I am not entirely without fear, moved product across the border and used a network of shell businesses to clean the proceeds. Daniel's import company was what they called a layering mechanism. My meticulous bookkeeping, my clean reconciliations, my organized reports. I had been providing what one agent described as professional legitimization services to a cartel operation that was processing millions of dollars a year. The documents I'd been given to work from weren't created before the transactions because they were prepared early. They were created before the transactions because the transactions themselves were fictional, constructed to justify cash deposits that came from drug revenue. I had been taking fictional invoices and matching them to real deposits and producing reports that made the whole thing look like an ordinary wholesale business. I had been, without knowing it, extraordinarily useful. I asked about Daniel. The agent with gray temples said that Daniel was a person of significant interest and that he could not discuss the specifics of any action related to him. The way he said it made me understand that they had known about Daniel for a long time and that I was, in some configuration, a door they needed to walk through to get to something larger. My lawyer, a woman named Patricia, who my mother found by calling every attorney in the phone book and explaining what had happened to her daughter, told me later that the DEA's initial theory was that I was a knowing participant, that the volume of money I'd processed and the consistency of my work made accidental involvement seem unlikely. She said they'd considered charging me with conspiracy to commit money laundering, which carries federal sentencing guidelines that I am not going to repeat here because even now, years later, reading those numbers makes me feel like I cannot breathe. What saved me, Patricia said, was two things. The first was my actual profile, my salary history, my apartment, my car, my bank accounts. If I had been a knowing participant in a cartel laundering operation for 14 months, I had apparently chosen to live in a one-bedroom apartment and drive a 2014 Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door. I had not been paid in any way that showed up anywhere except the $1,500 a month which I had dutifully reported on my taxes. The second was that I cooperated fully, immediately, and with a specificity that investigators found credible. I went through everything I remembered, every transaction, every document, every detail that had nagged at me and that I had filed away. I told them about the surname I'd recognized and when I'd seen it. I told them about the cash volume and when it had started increasing. I told them about the documents that seemed pre-prepared. Patricia said I was, from an investigative standpoint, extremely helpful. I was not charged. I was given what's called a non-prosecution agreement, which meant that as long as I continued cooperating and did not do anything that would change the assessment of my culpability, I would not face federal charges. I was required to provide full testimony in proceedings related to the investigation. I was required to attend a fairly grueling series of sessions with federal investigators during which I answered questions until I had no more answers left. Daniel was arrested 4 months after the agents came to my door. I know this because Patricia told me. I did not read news coverage. I could not. The question I've been asked in various forms by almost everyone who knows this story is, did you really not know? And my answer, the true one, is I knew something. I knew there was a shape in the dark that I was choosing not to illuminate. I had built, very carefully, a structure of not asking around a relationship that I needed to believe was what it appeared to be. I was not innocent. I was willfully incurious, which is its own kind of complicity, even if it isn't the legal kind. What I did not know, what I genuinely, truly did not know, was the scale of it. The name in the documents, the warehouse in the photographs, the other businesses in the network, some of which Patricia later told me had been connected to violence that I will not describe here and cannot think about for very long before I have to put my head between my knees. I did not know those things. I have had to make peace with the fact that I created the conditions in which not knowing was possible, and that peace is incomplete and probably always will be. I left San Antonio. I live in a different state now. I work in accounts receivable for a medical supply company, vetted thoroughly, I assure you, before I accepted the position. I work for people who run a legitimate business, and I verify that with a thoroughness that my colleagues probably find excessive. I think about Daniel less than I used to. I think about who he actually was, not the person I believed him to be, not the warm man who called when he said he would, but the person in those photographs, standing outside a warehouse I never saw, less than I used to. What I think about most, actually, is the girl who opened the documents and noticed they were pre-prepared and put that observation somewhere dark and quiet where it couldn't ask anything of her. I think about her with something that's a mixture of grief and anger that I haven't fully resolved yet. She was trying so hard to keep something good. She should have asked the question.